So today we come to the part of our course where pastoral care is linked to pain bearing. And we're going to follow through the questions just as they were asked in the lecture material. So we're going to start number one with trying to link the Trinitarian model of holding space, suffering space, transforming space to the concept of pastoral care at large and maybe some specifics of it. Shada, do you want to give that a start to get us underway?
Sure. Well, in linking it to what we read in Dijkstra, I guess it connects in a few different ways. I mean, certainly the intimate stranger, I think, is trying to enter into the suffering space. Like they don't have, in the situations at least described in the chapter where the model of intimate stranger might be most primary, like in chaplaincy and hospital. The physical aspects of holding space will not be as controllable by the chaplain. You basically have to be in the spaces that are available or are happening, you know. And so so there's a way in which the holding space, I think, becomes less literal, right? Like you have to like carry the holding space. It's almost as if like it's an energy. Like you always have to do this in ministry, right? It has to come from internal, but it'll have less of like physical embodiment. So I think the main thrust is sort of like I guess I kind of see the entering into the suffering space as primary in the intimate stranger. Whereas for the wounded healer, I do feel like that's more, that talks about more like, you know, the binding and of the wounds beforehand. There's a way in which there's like it focuses more on preparation, right? Like preparation of the person. So, and I feel like that focuses on the work that needs to be done that allows the spaces to come into being in the first place, right? Like if the intimate stranger seems to come in at pain bearing, wounded healer seems to like take a step back out of the whole sort of Trinity situation,
process, yeah.
right? And is like at least in terms of the dyad and is doing work that allows for the spaces to be created, right? Like working on the capacity for the spaces to be created. I mean, that's what comes to me at first, I think.
Sure. No, I think that's true. I spent a lot of time this morning reading and rereading that section on indigenous storytelling and how that all fits in. And I actually even went back to the Wemberley book to try to figure out from a chapter there what was going on, because the word indigenous is what keeps tripping me up, because it's related to the African American community, but I think he's using it in kind of an interesting way. The best definition, or the best example that I came up with was this definitional ceremony that he talks about, so that people who have lost have a feeling of loss together in a community. Say a village is about to be destroyed. I kept thinking about LTSP, engaged in the ceremony whereby they told their story to a group of outsiders and witnesses, primarily I'm guessing the succeeding group or whatever it happens to be, and then they became the audience and listened to these outsiders retell the stories that they had. So it kind of fits in with the Trinitarian thing in terms of us listening to stories, but then also doing maybe some mirroring or some reflecting back I know it's a different situation, but it's kind of that holding the space by retelling what your understanding of it is. And the point of the ceremony was to try to build some bridges between the group that was dissolving and the group that was, taking over, sort of thing. Very much in a village mode or a tribal mode as they looked at it. So it fits in, it seems to me, with this holding space and then transforming, that it allows you to go from this this grieving of a loss, basically, to a building of bridges with people that are new to the situation, which I thought was kind of interesting. It's not like outsiders telling their stories, it's outsiders retelling the story as they heard it. I don't know if it's practical at all in pastoral care.
Mm-hmm.
But that's, yeah, I like that. And we could certainly use a ceremony or two, I think, as we're going through these traditions or transitions. Sorry for the construction. Spoke about the other two, so I'll mention Nowen, who I absolutely love this chapter. He's been recommended to me many times, but I've never jumped in. And I think what he talks about in terms of preparing yourself, it seems to be in between that holding space and suffering space, that you can't really enter into someone else's suffering unless you're also attending to yourself and preparing a space both for yourself and for others. And so that suffering, right? Owning your own suffering, not as Dr. Swain talked about, not in order to say, oh yeah, I've been through that too, not to proclaim all the wounds that you've had and how great that's been, but to own it and to then be able to listen and reflect in a way that goes forward. I just want to reread that chapter 3 times. His writing style is incredible. So just an aside there, I guess, but that one spoke to me as so many people have said, I think, about Nowen. But in between there, yeah, I don't know.
Okay, I mean, I think that's good. I think we kind of made some connections there. Is there anything else anybody wants to throw into that discussion? Well, if not, then the second question asks us to take these images, I think, and relate them to our life and ministry. And I hate to form a pattern here, but Shada, do you want to take a start again?
Sure. Well, I guess now is a good. Okay, yeah, I'm trying to figure that. That is something that I wanted to share, and I was trying to figure out if this question or next question is better. But
right.
I did love Wounded Healer, but I really also loved Intimate Stranger because it spoke so clearly to what my experience had been of doing hospital chaplaincy. And I really wish I had had that chapter, when I was doing that work. So Michael, cling to that chapter.
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to reread it a number of times as the summer goes along. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because it really reflected my experience. Like there were a lot of things that I was really young, like I was 24. And so I had a lot of the ways in which hospital chaplaincy played out, like the dynamics that he's describing, I blamed myself for them, right? Like, so the things that are naturally impediments, the things that make the strangeness that he was just describing, I thought that was due to a deficiency in my own skill set, right? And it's not like my colleagues and my supervisor didn't try to dissuade me from that, but it was a really powerful story that I told myself about the work. And perhaps it was because it felt like then I would have more of a measure of control, right? Like if I was blaming myself, that meant at some level I had control, even if I wasn't able to exercise it. And so it was sort of really healing to just read the chapter and say, oh, everybody experiences like that. Like these are the conditions of the work. And I wish I had had the opportunity to more fully really absorb that and then go from there, right? Instead of always feeling in conflict with feeling that ambivalence he described, but then taking it back and putting it as a burden upon myself, right? Like with blame and shame. And I think it would have been interesting and nice to have let go of that a little bit, and it's possible I just wasn't ready at the time, certainly I recall my working with my supervisor on, you know, similar issues. So I think it's just where I was. But I wish I had the language, right? The strangeness language was really useful to me in terms of like articulating that sort of ineffable quality of that work. And I think that language would have served me to have it. So yeah, it really connected with my experience of doing that ministry for sure.
I'm again into this indigenous, even though that's not kind of technically part of this question, and thinking about where that connects with my ministry. And I see it in a couple of different ways. It sounds kind of odd, and it may not be exactly pastoral care. I'm not worried about the category so much here as the some of the changes in my life, and saying goodbye to the seminary and saying goodbye to a role that I played in my field experience. And I think in a lot of ways, it's a picture of a larger society. Shada and I were, I was talking and Shada was listening yesterday about a change in the way that religious affiliation happens in our churches, and that it being much more, instead of culturally expressive, individually expressive. And so that there's a loss of community there in a way that I think the church needs to pay attention to in terms of the narrative. So I need to pay attention to how those things play out in my life, this kind of loss of connection. And then I think the church at large does. I don't know if that kind of makes sense or not, but that's where I see it tying in right this second.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
I don't know.
Yeah. So we
don't have to go around in the circle, Adam. If we'd done that one in, maybe we should go to the strangeness.
No, yeah. I mean, I just thought we're in the same pattern here, focusing on the same chapters.
Well, I think it's kind of neat that it turned out that way.
Yeah, it did. It did. But yeah, I definitely connected a lot about that loneliness that Nowan talks about, and certainly been feeling that myself in terms of the abrupt change in identity, right? And that's what this course is about. And I haven't really labeled it until the last few weeks. Been feeling kind of listless and like, but it's been a year and a half now of saying I'm doing seminary, and the looks that people give you, and more about what I post on social media, because now I'm representative of something more than who I am, or more than who I think I am. So that loneliness, I've begun to feel that already, and it was really refreshing and empowering to read now and to have him just say, you got to own it. Just, you're gonna be lonely. We're all lonely. The way forward is to own that loneliness, and from that place of acknowledgement, you can then show other people that, yeah, you're lonely too, but that's the human condition, and God is with us through that. So that it was very powerful for me. It was one of those readings that hit me at the right time. I up until my call, I've been pushing away this call for so long that a kind of cynicism and irony has been my identity. And while I also acknowledge and knew while I'm being cynical that keeps you at an arm's length from the world, giving that up, not that I have to completely give it up, but your public persona, I feel like I can use that sense of humor less than I used to. And I don't know, that's just one instance of how the role of minister, of pastor has become a bit isolating and lonely for me. So that's where I see it in my own life right now.
Well, and it cycles us back to this crisis. The stranger metaphor that Shada was talking about. And that forms the next question, is just where do we see this strangeness in ministry? I even have a note here about what did the disciples do and how was their ministry strange? How did they find themselves in a strange position? So, I can start with that in terms of reflecting on, they're a week earlier in the Easter story, they're, entering into Jerusalem with, high hopes and high expectations. They go through this crushing, strange 3 or 4 days where things radically turn around in ways that I'm sure that they weren't expecting. And then I'm sorry, I'm still stuck on Emmaus and processing that, the road to Emmaus, where they say, we had hoped, when they were talking to Jesus. And I think that kind of the strange situation that they found themselves in that they never expected a week ago kind of leads us sort of into this crisis as stranger and stranger as crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I like that. I think, I'm really interested in trying to reclaim that strangeness for myself. Now that I have this new vocabulary around it and this new understanding about how God inhabits and works in and through strangeness, I feel like that's going to be really valuable. I had conceptualized my job, as a chaplain, and now as a minister in my mind, that it's my job to make things not strange, right? If things are strange, then it's on me. And I've done something wrong if things are strange or awkward or, and then somehow, right? And then, and I never really articulated this to myself, but imagining the strangeness and impediment to God and God transforming and people feeling God even, because a lot of times we, our spiritual moments, at least in my experience, have been described as primarily warm.
Connection sort of thing.
Yes,
fitting
right.
in. It all works together.
Right, flow. Yeah, right. Not strangeness. And so I'd formulated a story around that is my job to facilitate that kind of experience for people. And I think it would be really helpful for me to let that go. And so, Swedenborgian theology doesn't have a very strong theology of the cross because we don't have any substitutionary atonement. The cross doesn't have the same kind of emotional import that other Christian theologies have. But being educated in a Lutheran school, the question, what is it like to be at the foot of the cross, that Dr. Swain, that question would be to a Swedenborgian, what? But now that I understand what that means in a Lutheran and other Christian context, right, I can now connect it to this strangeness sense, right? That not that Swedenborgians don't believe God isn't in everything. It's just the metaphor of the cross is not something we worked with. And so, so connecting then what it means to be at the foot of the cross and this strangeness, I think, is going to be really productive for me in terms of really just being able to take a breath and not hold it all so tightly. I think that's a good thing overall.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to continue the metaphor here or whatever, but if you're Peter and you've just denied Christ 3 times and you realize that, how do you get beyond that? How do you say, God, I'm a stranger to myself. I don't even understand how I'm living in this situation. Or you're Mary Magdalene, stands there and watches and bears presence and can't figure out how this person that she's loved is hated by so many other people. So
right.
I like the crisis as stranger metaphor, I guess, more than I like the stranger as crisis. I mean, I'm trying to explore in my head. I know it's going to be unpredictable and not meet my expectations and not live up to the stories that I've already told myself about this CPE experience.
Mm-hmm.
I would just echo Shada's experience of like telling yourself that story that you have to be the one to facilitate all this wonderful growth and learning. And I felt the same way reading it. It's, yeah, you should prepare yourself for meetings and such, but it's ultimately not it's not on you, right? It's not all on the pastor to make those things happen. Part of what Dr. Swain asked was, where has woundedness got in the way of, I can't read my own writing, but where's woundedness gotten in the way?
Mm-hmm.
And I thought of a few instances already where with that idea that Nauman talks about of saying, oh yeah, I'm like that too, in my limited experience so far this year. One was in marital counseling where I sat in on one of the premarital meetings that our pastor had with a couple, and I just wanted to jump in at every moment and say, "Oh yeah, me too." But that's that's my story. That's not them. So that was helpful for me to connect that in a way that remembering to hold back when people tell their stories, because your story isn't. What is that? Just it gets in the way, right? It does become a stumbling block to the other person's healing. And then just the strangeness thing, I didn't of the stranger and as crisis and crisis as stranger, but I thought of just strange situations. And this past Sunday, one woman came up to me and said, I keep forgetting to say grace at meals since my mom died. Can you tell me what that's about? No, I can't. But I tried briefly after service to try to help her work through that, and she said, "Well, do you think it's because I, connect my mom to meals?" And yeah, I think that's probably what it is. But just how we're strangers to people in our congregations, as well as familiar, but we're also strangers in chaplaincy, especially. But it just was illustrative of you don't know what people are going to say or what they're working through. And it may be something like that, but that's not trivial, right? She's dealing with her mother's death. Just being a stranger in the presence of strangeness, that's what it made me think of.
Anything else on strangeness? Because I think this is an interesting tie into expectations about the profession and the predicament that we find ourselves in. Nobody has those kind of conversations with you unless they want not want something, but like are looking for something. And so it puts you in a different position. You can no longer have any strange conversation that's at a kind of just a regular human level. You're expected to somehow go to the transforming space somehow, with what they bring you.
Yeah, that is such, like, that expectation is such a burden. And it's how I have imagined, like, it's the rubric by which I evaluate whether or not I'm doing a good job.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so harmful to me. Like, I need to figure out how to let that go. And and I have another interesting question, like on what Adam was saying, like I really did appreciate, Dr. Swain pointing out about the, like, not just jumping in, yeah, me too, right? Like that, so important. And this feels like something that I've been, like, a theme for a lot of my classes. And Michael, you recognize it from our other one, universality and particularity, right? Like these two things, like we want connection with people. We want to know that we're the same as other folks, that we're not different or stranger, and at the same time, we also have our particularity and our uniqueness, and there have to be in balance. And so this is like a question for me, like, so we shouldn't jump in with like the, yeah, me too, absolutely. But like, what about how much of a relief it can be for people to understand that other people are going through things similar to them? So, like just having that edge of like, okay, trying to make sure I notice, like, when am I serving myself? Yeah, me too. And when am I hearing from them? Like, maybe they say a literal question, like, is that strange? Or maybe it's just like, a no, like something else you hear. But like, just making sure that I'm taking my cues from them on the, on the establishing the universality part, and not that it's serving me. And I just think that's a really important point that I hadn't thought about.
And Wemberley makes such a deal of telling stories and of participating in a community of storytelling with the person that you are giving care to, that I had to stop and ask that same question. It's like, when is that appropriate? When's that not appropriate? And I think that the distinction that he makes is that although it seems spontaneous, his advice is always that is planned. You know, that you have a repertoire of stories, but you planned it a little bit. He uses an example of Jacob in his book, where that reminds me of the story of Jacob, and not jumping into that, but then saving that for the next session and talking about a kind of a story about reading Jacob stories. Maybe I'm being really confusing, but I think it's like for a purpose as opposed to spontaneously me too.
Right.
And I really end up having to monitor almost everything, like you said, monitor on social media. But even in these exchanges, I think it takes conversation to a whole new level if we say narrative, counseling is the way to go.
Right. I think I was dealing with the same thing reading Wimberley, like, well, what, you telling your own story? But you're right. It's like having that bag of stories that you pull out when they relate to one story about your own child, or something with your parents. It's not belaboring it. It's using it as an illustrative tool, and stating it simply and directly as a tool, not as a teaching moment that was for you that can be illustrated for someone else. And I found that idea is helpful, that sharing of narrative, right? Getting in, how does caregiver's story and the care seeker's story fit into God's story and God's plan, which I also found very fascinating in that chapter, because that's an idea that I often have trouble getting my head around. But knowing when to share parts of our story that are helpful, and when, let me tell you about this time that happened to me, which isn't helpful.
Right.
Any other elements of our predicament that we want to discuss? Well, then let's move to the next question, which was the places in which we find suffering, both as individuals and as part of a collective. Shada did an amazing presentation last night at our one class about white fragility and how to address white fragility. So it gets me thinking about the suffering of groups and isms and all of that sort of thing, and homophobia, racial intolerance, misogyny. I see it played out in so many different ways.
Yeah. Now that that I try to answer this question, my answer is like, well, I guess the question is key places, but I'm like, suffering is everywhere. I had, a very anxious day on Tuesday, for example, over some very small thing, and I was suffering, me in my very privileged, functioning world, and then, so if I'm suffering, then there is so much suffering. I think this is really great poem that someone posted on Facebook once, and it's okay. I'm not gonna be able to get it right, but the main idea is somebody saying, like, I run my fingers over the globe, like a globe of the world, and I ask, where does it hurt? And the answer is everywhere. And it was just like, wow, just seems really powerful. Like, there is no, this is like, this is the get all Buddhist on you, but suffering is just everywhere and part of life, and it's part of our journey, and so many intersecting levels. I don't know, doesn't seem like it's a very insightful answer, but right now I'm just sort of feeling the magnitude of it.
Of course, I'd love to get least a Cliff Notes version of how to deal with white fragility. That sorry, I missed it.
There's no Cliff Notes. The Cliff Notes are 65 pages.
No,
I'll take it.
I'm happy to pass it on to you, Adam. It's a partner and I created a curriculum to try to deal with folks, try to build up stamina for these kinds of conversations with people. Like, so it's mainly with people who are resistant to talking about race, because we imagined we might find ourselves in those situations. So happy to pass it on to you.
I know I'm in that situation. It made me think of this question: where do we attend to it as a group? Made me think of where we are now, where I am now, and it's often right, kind of as Michael was talking about. It's in transitions, right? It's in changes where we have to really attend to the entire group, as opposed to, I mean, individuals. Certainly, that's what our readings were about: people in crisis, in a specific way. But when a group goes through transition, both the pastoral leaders here turned over last August, so of a group in transition, and we've seen how changes and decisions and communication have affected the suffering or perceived suffering of what's going on here. So I don't know, it just made me think of specific situations here, but also that those all have to do with when things change. That's when the group needs to be addressed as a whole and not just through individuals. Although saying as I say that, the communication piece was all about the fact that we didn't communicate individually to people, right? So sometimes the group is cared for and heard when you address individuals. That came up in our co-op meeting, actually, as part of the co-op cohort, and the conversation last week was about the transition from LTSP to ULS. What did you learn from that? And part of that was some people really didn't feel like they were heard in any way. That there are some people on staff and some professors who are very direct and willing to listen and sought students' input, but for the most part, they felt that there wasn't a lot of contact with how students were doing through the process. So again, as a group in crisis, it seems like it's when things change that we need to pay special attention.
Yeah, I'm kind of struggling with that whole idea too. And my follow-up question is when do people feel that they are heard enough? You know, how do you get to the point where, yes, suffering is important in telling narratives, and I understand the whole direction we're going here, but in this situation, in the most ideal of situations, could we have created a structure, or could we have created some conversations that would make everyone feel that they were heard? Or is not being heard always kind of like a part of the human condition?
Yeah, my husband has strong opinions about this, seeing as he has worked in sort of in church settings, not like directly, but like in a church-connected academia, and he is really blunt about it. He's like, people say they're not being heard when they're not getting their own way.
Right.
That's he's like, because he's had the experience of listening to people and listening to people and listening to people, and at the end of the day, having to say, thank you, and we disagree with you, and we're going a different way, and the people complaining that they weren't heard, what they meant was they didn't get to control the process.
Yeah, I think that's exactly where I was going.
And I think that's a particular danger for church communities, right? Because everyone wants to get their own way, and I'm not sure I know for sure whether or not how to deal with that, or I don't know.
Well, and maybe I'm going down a rabbit hole here, but if you're really engaging in narrative therapy or narrative counseling, rather, isn't there a sense of that as well? That when you have to have that difficult conversation, oh, you didn't listen to what I was saying, as opposed to, no, we have to go another way, as you say, and even kind of interpersonally.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that makes any sense or not. But
I think it's just, as with all good ideas and things, right? They can all spill over and be twisted and turn into something bad, right? And so I think, and I'm not trying to say that it's not important to hear people. Like I still commit to that process, and there's ways in which it can't fix everything.
Mm-hmm. So is that individual suffering of not being heard, able to be remedied, I guess, in the long run? I don't know. Interesting. I'm loving the narrative counseling chapter and how it fits in with my life. And I'm trying to tell lots of stories and think of lots of ways that my little white bread existence, which is my intersubjective narrative that I tell myself, has some interesting narratives to it. So may I share just a couple of mine, and then we can go around and talk about Culbertson in terms of genograms? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So totally, I've come to recognize that this idea of what I tell myself about my family may not mesh with reality, but instead of saying it's delusional, I liked Culbertson's quote about, I guess he was talking about Erickson, and he said something like, so psychologically, we are able to choose our families because we make up stories about them and figure out things about them. And I thought that was kind of comforting. It didn't have a judgment on it about having the family that you choose to create. So anyway, a couple of quick ones. One of the things that I noticed out of the genogram this week is, as I said last week to you guys, the top 3-4 levels all lived within 15, 20 miles of each other. And the bottom level is where people have gone off in terms of jobs or in terms of relationships and left the little area where we all lived. But maybe more interesting than that was my dad's father over here was shot while deer hunting in the woods, and that's a family narrative that was told in lots of situations. And I think, interestingly enough, I still have the coins that were in his pocket when they found him in the woods, because of course nobody said I shot this man in the woods while we were deer hunting, but they found him and the coins were in a little container that I still have. The narrative that it changed for me was in the center of central Pennsylvania. I never had a gun. I never touched a gun. I never went hunting in my life, which is very rare for males in our area. But more than that, his wife, who outlived him, as you see, by about 40 years anyway, spent the rest of her life very anxious. She may have been anxious before this, but I have no way of knowing, of course, because I'm so far removed in terms of age. But I know that I saw her be very anxious with my father about things, and especially his younger brother, who was 10 years younger. So at the time of the shooting was like 9 years old. So Bill down here in this, was really protected in ways that, or fussed over or more anxious about in ways that probably he would not have been. So generationally, I look at that in terms of the stories that my father told me, but I never had the sense of anxiety out of all of that. So I didn't come away changed a whole lot by that, but I'm sure I was in ways that, I can't even sort of imagine. The other thing that is a family narrative for me is that my mother and father, which strangely are separated on this chart, but Stanley and Louise, they actually were married 19 years before I came on the scene. So they were childless for 19 years, and they had this son. And the story was always, you know, how glad they were to have me. And a story that I told myself was, you know, King Michael sort of thing. That it was like, yeah, here I am. So it was something very special in terms of that, and I think that played out in stories that I've told about myself in defining who I am. I look back at an essay that I had written when I applied for postulancy a year and a half ago or something. It said I'm the only son of older parents, and so that's, you know, it's kind of a narrative that I tell about myself. And the other one that's sort of interesting, and it's not well reflected on this chart, is my one aunt was involved in an automobile accident in the early 60s and had a back injury that was pretty severe and limited her mobility. And there were a couple of things that come out of that. Number one was her sisters kind of rallied around her, and she was really the focus of the family, even though that she wasn't, no, she was the baby, sorry. She was the baby of the family, but they rallied around her even more in terms of this, taking care of her. And I'm sure that led to conflicts that I was not particularly aware of, but I'm sure that they existed. But the second thing that as I thought about the story is that there was a racial component to it. The accident happened down in the Florida Keys, and it was an African-American couple that plowed into the vehicle that hurt her. And so there was this whole, because I had absolutely no connection with African-American people growing up, there was this perception, well, they're bad drivers, they're evil people, they hurt my aunt, sort of deal. So they're the family narratives that I got out of my little world, and leading into, like Culbertson says, personal narratives or self-identifying narratives that are in the context of that larger picture. And then I guess I need another couple of weeks to figure out the interpersonal stuff, or the stories that I tell myself in secret about it all. So I do have one funny self-identifying one, though, that isn't related to the genogram, but I just want to share with you, is that I have a clipping of me in second grade being interviewed by the Harrisburg Patriot, like a little kids column sort of thing. And they have the little picture there, and I look like I've just gotten done picking my nose or something like that. And they asked me, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, I don't know, but I know that it will require an education. And so here I am at 8 years old being quoted as talking about education, and 62, or not 62 years later, but at 62, I'm still finishing this whole idea of education. So talk about a narrative that was passed on to me as a little kid that I'm, living out. So that's kind of my story. Any thoughts on those couple of things that I gleaned for my genogram?
Well, I mean, just that must have been really hard for your grandfather's family, to just lose him so suddenly. That's, even if your grandmother wasn't anxious beforehand, I know if it were me, I would probably have turned out exactly the same.
Mm-hmm, sure. Yeah. And in the context of a family where that just didn't happen very much, where there were no other outstanding traumas that I can document, it was pretty significant.
Yeah.
All right, I'll get off my screen. Somebody else want to try Culbertson and your genogram?
Sure. I will go. You'll just have to, as I said, promise my dad to keep it on the down low. So, but what I'm it's actually sort of been funny. Like, I confessed last time that I was having trouble figuring out triangulation on my genogram and stuff. And then like progressively it just was continuing to work and things became clear to me.
That is so weird with this process. It just, yeah. The more that you explore it, the more you think about it, the more triangles or the more whatever you see.
Right. Like it's not apparent immediately, it needs some processing. Yeah. So, I've definitely identified some triangulation that goes on between my husband and his he's the oldest, but his next oldest sister. They sort of triangulate against the younger sister. Sometimes their mom like subs in for one of them, but it's always usually like against her. Occasionally there's some natural triangulation in my own context because, my mom and dad and my brother are in Australia and I'm here. And so there's like the one who's away
Right.
just ends up being triangulated due to logistics and such and stuff like that. So, things became clear. In terms of like family narratives, well, first, I was extremely gratified to finally get a definition of intersubjective narrative, which has sort of been used this whole semester, and I didn't know what it meant.
Yes.
And I am
Hallelujah.
very satisfied with the definition. It's like, yes, that's exactly what that should be. But noting my preamble, I'm like, oh, it's going to take me a while to like notice those conversations in myself because I think a lot of intersubjective narratives are unconscious, right, or just below the surface. I'm just gonna have to like quietly like sneak around and notice, how I'm conversing with the different parts of myself. I'm just not like, oh, that's what I'm doing. Like I don't have those on the tip of my tongue. It'll take me a while to. So maybe next week. I'll report back next week. But in terms of family narrative, I already mentioned this last week, like the immigration story of our family, that my mom's parents, both immigrated from Europe, and all of my grandmother's siblings, like sort of, they scattered around the world. Some immigrated to the United States, to Canada, some stayed in Europe, some went to Australia. Like, they were from Latvia, and, they were refugees for a while, like just, everything exploded apart by the World War II, and they all immigrated. So like, that's the story, like this dispersion. And then my father also therefore emigrated from South Africa. So on both sides of my parents' families, the story and then of immigration and being at a distance and maybe not even seeing your family again. And then I continued it, like not consciously, but here I am, living halfway across the world from my family. And so that's our family story. And that is sort of incomprehensible to my mother's friend. But I thought about myself, like, what if my kids decided to do that? And I'm like, well, yeah, I wouldn't love it, but part of me would definitely be like, yeah, fair enough. Like, that's part of our story. Connected with that I've been thinking about a lot lately is my dad's story. He grew up in apartheid South Africa, and he did leave, like, till his late 30s. And he did leave like in the late 60s. So, like it was bad, but he left before it got really bad. But I've been talking with him about this recently, actually, for Church and Society class, about what that was like for him, and recognizing he's this very interesting combination of very innately empathetic of people. So he has to be progressive, but he's incredibly paranoid and suspicious of government, right? And so like just recognizing how his experience of growing up, in a situation where he did not align with the policies, but feeling like he could be that he was under a repressive government and could be squashed like a bug at any moment, like that created this sort of like his personal narrative around how to be in the world. And so, noticing the times at which like the scripts that I've enacted with him over that, like the pushback and the conflict over why you like this, like what because for whatever reason, as you were even pointing out, Michael, like it didn't transfer to me. Like I didn't imbibe that narrative around suspicion of government. I definitely imbibed his like progressiveness, right? Like, and what government owes people, like, because of shared humanity and such. but I didn't appropriate his paranoia, and that's really interesting too. Like, I'm wondering why I didn't, was in my environment that I was no longer in a repressive environment like he was. So that's just interesting, like, noticing that stuff. And what else? And just noticing some of the scripts that have gotten replayed, like the narrative around my mother's parents, that for a long time, the script was, as I mentioned, like, oh, here we are in this sort of unusual but happy arrangement with my grandmother living on the same street as my grandfather and his partner. And whether it was really truly okay with everyone, or whether it was for the benefit of just keeping things simple and easy for me, like for a long time, the only grandchild until my brother came along. I don't know. It's for sometimes it really, really seemed like everyone was genuinely okay with the situation. And so having that narrative played out, like we're all like good. And then noticing that my mother's younger brother, who was always a little bit of the misanthrope, having him share with me, like, my grandfather's sort of sordid history around, like some affairs and things. And, and just having the script suddenly flipped, right? Like the narrative was this, and now it's this, which was, and then having to deal with the dissonance that created of this, this grandfather that I loved, though I recognize he was also really kind of paranoid too. He like had barbed wire around his property and this enormous hedge. He grew up, in I guess in Poland pre-war, so that must have had something to do with it too. But like, wow, strange male paranoia in my family that I'm just recognizing. But just like recognizing, like, of course, I had this relationship with him that a young child has with their grandfather, and I knew he was a bit strange. And then to have that to have that narrative expanded, these two competing scripts, I think, is what I'm trying to say, right? And they're both true, though. Like, they are both true. And even at this point, I don't even quite know how to deal with it, but yeah, so cool. That's what I got.
For you, yay.
Yeah.
Man, I can't compete with pre-war Poland and South Africa.
Nobody can compete with Shada. That's the beauty of it.
No, I mean, I made a joke, but that no, yeah, right. Yeah. But yeah, that's very interesting. So some of the narrative stories that my family's told, I get into it. I'll throw it up here just so I can use my pointer, and I don't have to. Oh, that's not it.
That's you.
Stop sharing. That's not right. All right. I don't know what happened there. Hold on. Is this open? Yeah. Technology. Anyway.
It's all good.
Here it is. Let's see if it'll work this time. There it is.
Oh, yay. Okay.
Yeah, back to all these green lines, happy lines and red lines. The only thing I can relate to a little bit with Shada is that my grandparents, who divorced when my mom was 11 or 9 or something, are now living in the same retirement community. Mm-hmm. And my mom goes to visit them regularly. Thinking of narrative stories, my grandmother loves to tell sort of stories about, this is the way we are, and it's because we are German, or it's because we are this, or these kinds of stories. And as a young child, she and I think her parents talked about their family, her mother, Smith, coming over on her family coming over on the Mayflower. My mom looked into it, and there's no way that's true. So that's one of those stories that clearly kind of got handed down. And I read something once about how, like, if everybody who says their family came over on the Mayflower, it would have been like, this giant ship. But
it's okay. Everybody was on Noah's Ark, so
thinking about how stories get passed down and get changed, I think we all love my grandmother, and she was very doting when she visited with us as kids. But I think our generation, and especially my dad, challenged a lot of those kind of family narratives that she brought down. And my dad, as I mentioned, is a pastor. He's now a bishop in the Lutheran Church. He's also very kind of likes to be straightforward. And so he doesn't have a lot of time for those kind of family myths, I guess. Not in a mean way. It's just like sort of in a, okay, yeah, that's not true kind of way. I think me and my siblings, these four here, we kind of grew up with kind of that healthy distrust of family narratives, and kind of changed coming down. And as I mentioned, my dad, on my dad's side, he was kind of distant from his father, and his father's father, the narrative is, we're not sure what happened with him. He was raised by relatives, and so there's some mystery on this side, and but my mom also found out that, I forget which way it went, but my great grandfather was one of the train children that was sent from New York to the Midwest. I don't know if you've heard about this, but it was, she read a book on it as well. It was where people would just be picked up, like kids, lots of orphans and street children and kids trying to work in New York City. And church organizations would go to the streets of New York, and they started just picking them up, saying, oh, we're going to help you. And they'd put them on a train to Chicago, and then they'd say, oh, there's going to be kids here this day. And people from churches would just come and get the kids. And what would happen is often those kids would just be put to work at this time. So it was like late 1800s, early 1900s. And apparently my great-great-grandfather was one of these children. And the narrative that I never heard until recently was that he ended up being an alcoholic and just lived by himself in a shack down by the river, literally. Probably he had no sense of real connection because he was pulled from his family by well-meaning church goers. So anyway, that's something I recently learned. But
wow,
I don't know. Yeah. So, but the other thing I wanted to share, thinking of family narratives and our sort of healthy meta distrust of our own family narratives, is that this picture hangs in my parents' home today, and it was there growing up. I don't know if you can see all that. Remember, as far as anyone knows, we're a nice, normal family. So the family narrative in my house is through humor and popular culture often. And that's cute and all, but I also feel often that it's sort of indicative of the way that my family is a typical Midwestern, sort of stoic, sort of Scandinavian, German, we don't share our feelings kind of family. So we use humor to cover up what's really going on. And mostly my father was a model of that. And my mother is intensely introverted and only recently has started to figure out what that means. Yourself comes out in strange ways. But in any case, just family narrative that we have that I already kind of know about is that, you know, we're a nice, normal family, which is great, but it means you're hiding something. The weird thing is that, you know, we aren't really hiding that much. There's not a lot of personal trauma or conflict in our family, and the thing we're hiding is that we're goofy, I guess. But also we aren't always straightforward and honest with each other in a way that, is productive. We keep each other at a distance, which I was starting to work through how to change that paradigm, and I don't know.
Is the humor thing recognized? I mean, the use of humor to kind of mask things, is that something that's recognized, Adam? Or, I mean, is like that talked about and acknowledged, or is that totally under the surface?
No, it's pretty upfront.
Yeah.
So I think it's recognized. Makes me think of, you know, family roles within the family. Whenever we get together, I'm a lot funnier than I am in normal everyday life. So
I think you're pretty funny anyway.
well, thanks. But there was one meeting a few years ago where my youngest brother, who we weren't very close because he's 8 years younger than I am, but it turns out we're the most alike. So I'm actually kind of closer to him now. But I made some joke, and he said, "Oh yeah, I'm Adam. I'm the funny one." So, calling out the roles that we had assumed for ourselves, which I think was actually, it was helpful for me to kind of step back for a second. So, I don't want to give you the impression that we're in any family crisis. It's just that we, you know, could be more direct, and we show our affection in indirect ways, which is okay. But yeah,
I think
So,
that's
thanks
an
for
important point. You know, it is okay. You go into this with this presumption that everybody's pathological and in pain and suffering, and I recognize all of that. But at the same time, the narrative, I mean, to go back to that Erickson quote, we construct these narratives for ourselves, and it may be more helpful in my case to, you know, to keep a cheery narrative going than a wounded healer narrative going. I don't know. I mean, I think we should at least allow space for that. If it becomes a delusion, I get it. You know, I mean, if you're really ignoring or total denial, but how you frame things, I think, is so important. So, I don't know.
I mean, that connects me back to, I think, why I connected. Thanks for making this connection for me. That with Henry now and in the loneliness thing, right? If you come from a family where you show affection in sort of indirect ways, it can be a little isolating. So and again, I'm not in crisis, but
Sure.
It's one of those things where you see a thread. So thank you.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay, guys, anything else about Culbertson and our families, their stories? Or I too, though, Shada, appreciated finally figuring out interpersonal in some depth, and this idea that there's this little collection of selves talking inside of my head. I love, because I only thought it was me, you know. So it's good to know that there are lots of other people having lots of other conversations going on. So who's talking to whom? Sometimes it's really kind of confusing, but anyway. All right. Well, I guess we're done for this week. So thanks a lot.
All right.
Fun. I'll turn the thing off and then we can chat for a second.